Now, it can be kind of depressing to look at all of these different predispositions, all of these diatheses, all of these things that can make us more or less susceptible to stress over time. But it is very important to sort of make note of the fact that an increased risk or a predisposition towards certain things is not something that's deterministic. That's one of those sort of faults when a lot of people start interpreting different genetic components, where if we identify a gene that's linked with something, people assume that, oh, if you have the gene, you are going to have whatever it is. But we're basically just saying that we can have these predispositions. You can have a diathesis, but you can still have those environmental influences as well. So there are ways to enhance your resilience, your ability to sort of handle these stressors in a much more beneficial way, to try and mitigate some of those risks, some of those likelihoods that can come across with that predisposition. And hopefully, I've done a pretty good job of explaining the potential for a whole bunch of different confounding variables. As per usual, when we talk about a lot of different psychological theories and ideas and concepts, we're really stuck with a lot of observational studies when it comes to human research. So we aren't able to make these direct causal relationships, these direct causal connections. We're really stuck with associations. And while we, yes, can do our best to try and control for any confounding or third variables, there is always that possibility that there's something else going on. And that's another one of those sort of reassuring facts to go along with our determinism is not what we're getting from a diathesis. But to continue onward, we've managed to talk about some of our vulnerability factors, things that can affect our ability to resist stress, to handle stress in a healthy and much less harmful way. Where some of these factors are going to be things like if we don't have a support network. Mainly, we had talked, I believe, about the fact that those who do have a support network tend to have more resilience or more resistance. So, not having one would therefore be the opposite. If you don't have skills to help you cope with stressors in your environment, whether this is you don't have the tools to handle these kinds of situations that you're going to be encountering, or whatever it is, those or that lack of skills can make you more susceptible to stress. So maybe going out and finding or practicing some coping skills might help. We did also look at the fact that optimism is something that's fairly protective, and therefore pessimism would be something that is reducing our ability to resist our stressors, so making us more vulnerable to the effects of stress. So let's delve more deeply into that protective, more positive framework for the things that can protect us and increase our resilience when facing stressful situations. So, social support is really important. Why? Well, it can help blunt some of the impacts of stress. It can give us our sort of sense of identity. It might even give us a sense of meaning in what our actions are. So maybe if you're part of this group and your group is undergoing a stressor together, you might feel united, that you're working towards a common goal, that you are sort of connected to these individuals with you. And your sort of unpleasant encounters, the stress that you're experiencing, all of that extra work might mean something because now it's something you're working with this support group, with these people that you care about. Having other people around is also a really great way to help prevent you from having maladaptive coping mechanisms. Basically, if you're somebody who maybe spirals and panics when facing a stressful situation, you might have somebody who's able to calm you and focus you and keep you from, say, overestimating the intensity of a situation or underestimating your ability. So they can encourage much more positive and useful frameworks that'll help you approach the problem in a much more manageable and helpful way. When we look at those who have stronger support systems, more high quality friendships, we see that that correlates with an enhance to your immune system. So there's been a bunch of different studies, but a couple in particular look at cancer patients. And those who have a support system are actually able to sort of share some of their negative life events. They can talk about things that have led them to struggle. But by sharing that, instead of just sort of venting in a more catharsis framed way, just sharing and having people to hear them and feel validated by that support, they tend to show that their sort of outcomes are better. They tend to see better immune functioning, better recovery rates, and things like that. So it's a lot about having those people who are there, people who are with you, giving you that social support. We can also have other kinds of support that can kind of fold under this social umbrella. So, some people can offer us emotional support. So, they are there for you emotionally. They can express empathy and love and care, basically showing you that you matter, even when you are experiencing this stressful situation. So, you know that you still have value, you still have people who are there with you, and that can be something that ends up sort of boosting how you feel about yourself. We can also see people that offer instrumental support, where this is just when we have some tangible help. So maybe they're going to help you do something, they're going to do something for you. So if you're trying to study for a class, maybe they're going to offer to take notes out of the textbook so that you don't have to do that part, but you'll now have condensed notes to study from instead. So they've done something tangible, they've made this instrumental action that is going to make you better prepared for facing that stressor of your upcoming exam. You might have people with informational support, where they can give you advice and useful information that'll help change the impact of a stressor that you're encountering. So, if this person has taken the class before you, maybe they can tell you what you should be studying. They're giving you that information. They can advise you in how you might study to do more effectively. So, that can be very, very useful if they're giving you information you wouldn't have had otherwise, because they're effectively boosting that sort of secondary appraisal. They're giving you resources you didn't have, which makes us much more likely to view something as a challenge. And then the last is our appraisal support, where you can have someone who helps you evaluate to carry out those appraisals. And they can say, okay, here are the demands of this situation, and here are the resources available to you. But having a second person, especially somebody a little bit removed from the scenario, they might not have the same biases as you do as someone within that scenario. So you might underestimate your own abilities, but they might have a more clear headed and less biased view of what you're capable of doing. So maybe they're going to remind you of, well, actually, you've done something similar before, and here's how you solved it. Or when you're looking at those potential demands, you might think that you need to do X, Y, and Z, but they'd say, well, actually, to get a solution, you only really need to do X. You can kind of skip the others and it won't have an effect. So, again, just a second pair of eyes to be there to help you with those appraisals and hopefully help you get past some of your own biases. Now, we did already introduce the idea of being able to share these sort of negative experiences when we were discussing our cancer patients on a previous slide, where having that support system of people who can listen to you talk about some of your negative feelings, some of your negative experiences, ended up having sort of a net positive effect. And so this next little bit here is looking at the effects of bottling up feelings versus being able to get them out. And again, we're sort of stressing it's not like that catharsis theory, where we were saying that venting to sort of alleviate feelings of anger doesn't necessarily translate as well as we had thought. This is more just saying, do we have this environment where we can get these things out, where we can sort of share with others, and probably focus in a lot more on the support and acceptance that comes along with that. But just making some connections to earlier topics. When we look at those who bottle up their feelings, having that inability to express their negative feelings can actually come with some detriments. Basically, if you're bottling things up, that can actually increase your stress. So we see a correlation with an increased likelihood of cancer and a bunch of other health problems, depending on the studies. But expressing our emotions, and they stress here, in an adaptive manner. So not so much just complaining and dumping on somebody else, but in this environment where you can share and be heard, we typically do see some long-term positive consequences. So long-term health improvements overall. And again, as there are typically many, many studies, we're going to just look at one example. We don't really care too much about the details here. I just want to focus on the patterns that we're seeing. So along the bottom for the first of these graphs, we're showing our different symptoms, so stress and depression. So those tend to maybe associate with one another, as we've seen. And this value is mean percentage of change, basically saying that for 0, if nothing has changed, if somebody's score is the same, then we'd be at that 0 mark. If we have something below that, we're saying that something has dropped. If we're above that, the change has been positive, so something has increased. And they're just looking at a group that's able to disclose some of their negative feelings, and the control group wouldn't be given that opportunity to share those feelings, so they'd be bottling up their negative experiences. And so from our interpretations here, our disclosure group, whether they were individuals with high levels of stress or high levels of depression, or a little bit of both, we see that net negative, meaning that that disclosure allowed them to get rid of some of those feelings, and they end up feeling better. So their change in stress is lessened. So disclosing reduces their effects of stress, reduces their feelings of depression, so a net good thing. Another metric that's commonly used is looking at things like the number of sick days, where we'd say, okay, is this something that's now impacting your life? Is this something that's causing problems so that you're having to stay at home? And so if you're sick more often, which we've seen correlates with higher levels of stress, this is a pretty good metric to look at. So once again, we have our control group with no disclosure, and then our disclosure group in the teal. And with our baseline, this is just our starting point. And both groups start at the same number of sick days, sort of as their average, which is important because we want to make sure that there's consistency before they undergo their treatment of disclosure or not. But what we find is that for those with the sort of disclosure group, it's not so much that they took less and less sick days, it's that their sick days didn't keep increasing. Whereas our control group, we saw this net increase in the number of sick days that they were taking after that amount of time for this study had passed. So basically saying that by bottling up these feelings, they're ending up sort of with higher levels of stress, and it's causing more damage to their immune systems or whatever it is that causes them to take more sick days. So it isn't necessarily going to show the drop due to disclosure, but it prevents the increase due to lack of disclosure. So sometimes when we see these differences, we have to kind of pick apart exactly what it is that's going on, but we can definitely say that the disclosure group ended up with better outcomes than the control group did for kind of all of these considerations, which is important. And like I said, the specific study doesn't really matter. We're just looking at patterns where disclosure is helping over. And then we can look at some more of our protective factors, getting into this idea of hardiness, which is really just another way of us saying that you are resistant to stress. So if you are fairly hardy, we can talk about, say, plants that are really hardy, meaning they resist frost, they're able to survive in harsher conditions. So hardiness applied to humans and stress is just that you're able to sort of withstand more stressful scenarios with less of those negative side effects. So similar idea, slightly different name in this context, but for some of the things that can fall under this, things we need to evaluate when assessing someone's hardiness, we can look at their commitment. So how committed are they? How set are they on accomplishing this task? If this is something really, really important and they know that it's important, they would have high levels of commitment, which means that they're probably a lot more likely to persist to kind of push through. Control is another really important aspect to consider because we've looked at this before with that idea of self-efficacy or our internal versus external locus of control. So control is all about, do you think that your actions are going to make a difference? Do you feel like you can undergo certain behaviors that are going to help this situation, that allow you to solve this problem or overcome whatever our stressor is? So It doesn't have to be actual control in this situation, because we've said before, people have very biased interpretations of their environment. But even the act of having perceived control over a situation, if you feel like your actions are going to matter, that can be really, really helpful. And it can mean that you're much, much better at handling that stress because you feel like you have power in that situation. You are in control, you have a say, as opposed to it being out of control and out of your hands, which ends up being a far scarier and therefore far more stressful situation. We also can consider the challenge versus threat distinction, where if we frame something as a challenge, then we're usually approaching it with a much more positive mindset. So we would say that someone who has a very hardy, or if we have a very hardy individual in terms of stress response, we would say that they are very committed to what they do, they feel like they are in control, and they are likely to frame a situation as a challenge. Now, when they try and pick apart sort of all of these and which one has the highest weightings, which one is the most important, the control ends up being the most important in many, many, many situations. So for humans, we really don't like feeling out of control. Uncertainty bothers us, not feeling like there's anything that we can do, feeling like somebody else is the one in charge of everything can be really, really discomforting. It can make us highly stressed simply because there's nothing we can do to handle this. So we just have to deal with whatever comes at us, and that feeling is not going to help us handle a situation very well. Sometimes, in cases where we feel like we have little control, though, some individuals might pull sort of reassurance, might pull support from spiritual beliefs, where you might say, well, I have no say in this, I have no control in this, but it must be happening for a reason, or it is because of this aspect of my beliefs. And that kind of sort of calm, that kind of belief and feeling that it's not in my hands, but it's in someone else's and I trust them, that can help alleviate some of those feelings of negativity with a lack of control. Though, on the flip side, some spiritual beliefs might make us more likely to frame certain things in a more negative way. So, things like fear of punishment or feelings of guilt can end up inhibiting our ability to resist stress. So, it can be sort of a double edged sword, just depending on the religion or belief or whatever, be the person and see the situation that we're looking at. So, as per usual, it gets fairly complicated. And if we go back to what I just mentioned, that idea of self efficacy, which keeps coming up. So, if we wanted to have sort of the best chance of feeling like we can do well in this situation, if we are high in self efficacy, we're probably going to see things like if you're reminded or have had previous experiences like this where you were successful, those successes make you more confident in your abilities in the moment. Seeing others, especially others of similar ability or even lesser ability, doing well in that situation can definitely make us feel more confident that we can do it too. That social persuasion or encouragement, having somebody who tells you that you can do it, who says that they're there for you, you're supported and cared for, that can be really helpful. But even the social persuasion, having somebody to push you in whatever way they're doing that, whether it's maybe some light teasing to push you forward, as long as it's framed in a positive, I believe you can do this, that kind of persuasion can end up giving you higher levels of self efficacy. Some people might be motivated by spite or wanting to show someone that you can do something that they didn't believe you could. So we can fold that in under that category. And then when we get into sort of overall physiological arousal, being too worked up can be really problematic. And that can depend dramatically on if you frame that being worked up as being nervous versus something like being excited, where a high level of arousal, but it's excitement, might make you better off in approaching a task. But if that same level of sort of being worked up is framed as nervousness, it can hinder your sort of self efficacy. So typically, lower levels of arousal, not being too worked up, tends to set you up for more likelihood of success. But there is always, of course, some variation in the background. And we can say with this sort of improved self-efficacy, we also see that higher levels of efficacy, self-efficacy, are related to increased immune system functioning. The wording here is actually a little bit implicating a directionality that increasing your self-efficacy will increase your immune functioning, but it's probably a lot safer to say that high levels correlate with high levels of functioning rather than assuming causality. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about some of the sort of specific aspects that can increase our resilience to stress, I actually do want to get into some of our different areas of psychology and related fields where we actually start studying and sort of advocating for different practices that would help people cope with stress and therefore help with their long-term health in sort of these different situations. So we're getting into health psychology, which will get us into health promotion and so on and so forth, all the way up to positive psychology. But with health psychology, we're recognizing that behavior definitely plays a role in health maintenance, and we have this close relationship between our actions and our thought patterns and our health and stress and its effects on health, because we've spent the whole chapter on that. So yeah, when we look at studies of psychological and behavioral factors for health psychology, the goal is to find ways to prevent and treat illnesses and to maintain health. And treating and coping with stress can definitely be an aspect of that. So one of the things they focus on are health-enhancing behaviors, which are basically competing against these health-compromising behaviors. But our health-enhancing behaviors are things that are going to help us maintain or increase our health. So things like exercising. Exercising improves your health in the long run. Having a healthy diet. Safe sexual practices, regular medical checkups. And all of these things are going to help us so stay healthy if we are already healthy. It can help us avoid things that could harm us in the future. So things like breast and testicular self-examinations, watching for signs of illness in the future. So these kinds of preventative measures can definitely help us enhance our health in the long run. And then if we think health compromising behaviors are going to be the opposite. They promote the development of illness or the worsening of illnesses. So it's basically all the stuff you are not supposed to do. So smoking and having fatty diets, a sedentary lifestyle, risky sexual behavior, all of that would fall into things that are risky and potentially compromising of your health. And so for health promotion, they would be trying to encourage people to undergo more health enhancing behaviors, but also stopping any health compromising behaviors, while also acknowledging that not everyone is going to be as motivated to do one or the other. So a lot of different psychological aspects, and hence health psychology. So, how do people actually make this switch from health compromising to health enhancing behaviors? So, one sort of way of listing this is to look at our pre contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and then termination, which is their long way of saying that at the beginning, you typically start thinking about, well, this is a thing. I have knowledge that exercising is probably healthy. You get into the contemplation state that says, you know what, I probably should be exercising. This is something that should happen. It's probably going to help with weight and stamina. So I'm not out of breath every time I go up the stairs and all of these other things that are beneficial. We would then get into that preparation. It's like, okay, well, what do I need to do to start exercising? Do I have a time slot that I could plan to go to the gym twice a week? Is there a gym nearby? So you can get prepared, get signed up for your gym membership, all of these things getting ready. And then action. Go to the gym during that set time twice a week. So actually take care or start doing that action. Maintenance is, once we've started forming habits, it tends to be pretty easy to continue with those habits. So this is going to be the sort of, I can continue with this and I can continue motivating myself with this. When we get into termination, so this might be more of the You don't have to work as hard to keep doing something. Or it could be that if we were looking at something like termination of, say, smoking. So if we started at the sort of beginning of I should stop smoking, and you'd have your thinking about or being aware of it, thinking about it, preparing to quit, actually quitting, keeping yourself from starting again. Termination would be that point where you're no longer tempted to quit and you can kind of stop those motivating behaviors. But for some of them, like exercising, there isn't really a logical, you terminate not going to the gym, maybe is how we could frame that one. So the last stage doesn't always apply, but there's a couple of ways we can apply this to a bunch of different types of actions. And we don't need to go into a ton of detail on this because when we're looking at these health enhancing behaviors, avoiding a sedentary lifestyle, which comes along with correlations with heart disease and obesity and a bunch of other factors, they typically look at what are the benefits. If there are these detriments to an unhealthy sedentary lifestyle, what are the benefits to an active and healthy lifestyle? So for different kinds of exercise, you'll have different types of benefits. But when we look at aerobic exercise, basically things that get your heart running. So this would be things like maybe you run or jog or even go for very quick walks. We end up using and exercising our cardiovascular system. So we start seeing that we're more efficient at using oxygen. Our lung capacity is going to increase. We're going to sort of be able to move better. We also see it comes along with lower cholesterol levels. Big important thing for sort of regulating other components of our bodies. We have, or I guess the next point is that when we start looking at this exercise, there is the potential for people to overdo it. Um, so you would think that if exercise is beneficial, if it's helping you sort of use resources better, to be more efficient, to have your body running better, that you should just exercise to excess. But moderate levels tend to be the best, where if you don't exercise enough, it's not really going to cause a big change. But if you exercise too much, you can actually end up doing damage. So some people might overdo it and maybe they damage their joints, or maybe they lose too much weight too quickly, which can come with its own health problems. And all sorts of other things. So for a lot of this, moderation is going to be best. With exercise, whether it's aerobic or other types of exercise, it helps to improve your physical health overall. You're often going to find better immune functioning because our bodies are operating at a much more optimal level. We tend to see that people who exercise tend to live longer, and that's for a bunch of different reasons. So exercise is overall a good thing, which shouldn't surprise anyone, which is why we're not touching on too many details of this, basically just a bunch of highlights. When it comes to other things that maybe are a little bit easier to change, something like maintaining a healthy sleep schedule can be really, really important for your overall health and can make you more resilient to stress because you are rested, recovered, and have more resources to handle potential stressors. So getting regular sleep, getting enough sleep, can help you cope better with different situations and is typically associated with better health and longevity. Of course, if you're talking exercise, people usually also talk about diet, where having a good representation of different types of food groups is going to get you the nutrients that you need, the right amounts of those. So, not overeating and not undereating is very important as well. There's all sorts of different types of behaviors that you can consider. But like I said, a lot of this is logic, things that you already know intrinsically, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here. I did want to touch, though, on positive psychology, which this is one of our areas of psychology that's gotten a lot of popularity sort of in recent decades. So it was originally kind of proposed around the 1950s. So Abraham Maslow is one of our sort of characteristic humanistic psychologists who focused in on this positive psychology, started using this term. And you might remember that our humanistic psychologists often focus on some of the other perspectives, especially our Freudian psychodynamic perspectives and our behaviorist perspectives, and view them as fairly negative, fairly pessimistic, or fairly not applicable to humans. And so these different swings, getting into our humanistic psychologists of Maslow and Rogers, they really like the idea of focusing on the positivity, the optimism of humans, and the fact that we have this ability to control our actions, and that maybe we should look at our motivation in terms of us striving to improve and do better. And so that positive spin on things actually ties really, really nicely to our discussion about stress and then health, because, well, we've seen already that optimism is one of those protective factors. Having a more positive mindset, feeling in control, those are things that help us resist stress better and and correlate better with positive health outcomes. So, from the history of this, starting around the 1950s, the current usage of it would come from Martin Spiegelman, or Spieligman. There we go. I couldn't keep those letters in order. But the name isn't super important. We're basically saying that they wanted to really focus on thinking positively, framing things in a more positive light, thinking on the bright side, and things like that. And in today's view for positive psychology, they really dislike that modern psychology, modern being since the 1950s, that we've been focusing way too strongly on pathology, on diagnosing and treating different illnesses or disorders. And so they really wanted to focus on more human-specific stuff framed with that positivity. So looking at beneficial experiences, good well-being, things like that. This doesn't mean that we should be ignoring entirely our negative experiences and the potential for illness. This is just saying that we also need to consider these aspects, and the rest can also be there. It just doesn't have to be the only focus. So it doesn't completely go against some of the other fields. It's just adding another layer to it, as per usual. And so, with our positive psychology, what are some of the contributions that might be useful? A lot of these are going to be things that we've probably figured out from our earlier discussions, but as a sort of wrapping up point, it's not a bad place to be. We're saying, okay, we have some suggestions here that help maintain and enhance personal happiness and resilience to stress, and may improve health. Spending time with others and working to develop those close relationships, building up that social support network and making use of that network is definitely going to be beneficial. People should look for ways to be helpful to others and reach out to the less fortunate. When we start sort of interacting with those in the community, we tend to feel better about ourselves, so that might be an important factor. It can also make us feel like we're making a difference, and we had said before that that feeling of control and being able to make a difference can really, really help in our own sort of frameworks. When we're setting goals, it's really, really important to be kind of realistic. We did specify that you could sort of overestimate your abilities a little bit, kind of pumping yourself up and telling yourself to sort of push and do your best, and you can totally do this, can be helpful, but you still want to keep it realistic. Because if you overestimate your abilities, if you are too optimistic, you end up being sort of sorely disappointed when it can't happen. So you do want to have that reaching and striving, but you want to make sure that it's not an unrealistic goal. Otherwise, it's not really going to help. It also is very useful to have a meaningful goal. So this thing, if it matters to you, if you can sort of look at why this is important, what it's going to do in the long run for you, that tends to improve our approach towards it. And it will help us make progress towards those goals. I think we've talked before about the concept of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, where some people will be extrinsically motivated, They are doing things for external sources. So you are working really, really hard in a class because your parents want you to get a good grade, or because you need this class to get your degree. Whereas if we are intrinsically motivated, it's an internal source. So you want to do this because it's interesting to you, because you would like to learn the skills that this class gives you. So that internal aspect actually makes you much more likely to persist in that pursuit, and it tends to associate with better performance along with that longer persistence. So that meaningful personal aspect can be very, very important from a whole bunch of different perspectives. Some other things that, again, seem kind of illogical. So, making time for things that you enjoy, having that sort of awareness of you can enjoy yourself, you can be who you are, that can really help your mental health. It can help your headspace and could improve how you face different challenges in the future. The physical well being component, we've talked about the direct effects on health, but sometimes physical well being is actually part of mental health and other aspects as well, where feeling in control, doing something that gets you maybe out of the house, that gets you working, so getting your heart rate up, doing something that makes you feel powerful, can be really helpful for a bunch of different ways. Being open to new experiences, trying new things. Sometimes when people feel like they're stagnating, like they're stuck, or that things don't change, that can relate to a feeling of being out of control and having no power. So, trying new things, going out and feeling like you can do something, that you can make those changes, can really be useful. And then the last point of trying to be optimistic and trying to focus on the positive, seeing if you can change some potentially ingrained negative thought patterns, that can definitely set you up for success, because we've stressed a lot that optimistic approaches tend to correlate with better outcomes across a bunch of the things we talked about throughout the chapter.